مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. لم تمض أسابيع قليلة منذ أن أقسم جو بايدن قسم توليه لمنصبه وانتهى شهر العسل. في الأيام الخوالي كان الرؤساء يمهلون شهور لوضع أجنداتهم وتحقيق نجاحات كبيرة قبلما يبدأ النقاد وخاصة من حزبهم في استهدافهم. في عصر الإنترنت تحولت الشهور إلى أسابيع، وبايدن يواجه بالفعل معارضة قوية لبعض مرشحيه وأولوياته التشريعية على حد سواء، بما في ذلك من الديمقراطيين. هل سينجح بايدن في خطته لهزمة تحفيز ستكون هي أكبر قانون للإنفاق في التاريخ الأمريكي؟ هل سيسير التقدميون على أن تشمل زيادة بالغة في الحد الأدنى للأجور؟ هل سيطالب المعتدلون بالنهج أكثر توادعاً؟ هل ستؤهد المعارضة الجمهورية صفوف الديمقراطيين أم أنها لن تؤدي سوى زيادة الانقسام داخل الحزب؟ لمناقشة نهاية شهر أصل الرئيس بايدن والتحديات التي تواجهه داخل حزبه، يسرني أن أرحب باثنين من أكثر مراقبي السياسة الأمريكية تبصرا، رولاند مارتن ونورمان أورنستين. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Terms in American politics change with time. Liberal meant one thing 100 years ago, something else today. And so too a term which is very important in American politics, defining a key wing of the Democratic Party and a lot of the ideas that are insurgent in our politics today. It's the term progressive. Who are the progressives? What do they want? How do they relate with traditional coalitions and the Democratic Party? We're going to look at this part of American politics with our guests today, Roland Martin and Norman Ornstein. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me.
Glad to be with you, Rob.
First, Roland, let me ask you, what does the term progressive mean to you?
Well,
what does it mean?
Here's the problem with how you define that. It depends on what part of the country you're in. So you can be progressive from the Bronx, and you can be Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Then you can be progressive and be Congresswoman Maxine Waters from Compton in California. And then you can be progressive and be Texas Representative Al Green. And it varies depending upon the region of the country that you're in. And so I think that's part of the problem that Democrats have. The truth be told, the Democratic Party tent is far more massive and large than Republicans. When you say conservative, look, it's real clear. You hate abortion, you hate gays, you love guns, you love God, period. And so that's the struggle people have depending upon where you're from. You can be progressive in Georgia and somebody in New York will say, oh my God, you're a conservative Democrat. That's the struggle.
All right. Norm, when you hear progressive, what does that term mean to you?
So there are a couple of ways to answer that, Rob. One is Democrats used to embrace the term liberal. That is not embraced as much anymore because to a significant share of the country, it just doesn't work for them. So they moved to the term progressive, which sounds better, I guess. And I would say the party itself has moved to the left some, although not in an extreme way. But progressive means you want a larger role for government. It means that on social issues, and it's exactly what Roland said with the opposite, that you are for choice in abortion, that you support not just same-sex marriage, but that you support rights for transgendered and other people who lack gender identification, that you want to have open voting for everybody. And there is a continuum. And that continuum goes from the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wing of the party which frankly, if you look at the elected representatives, is not a really big one, all the way across to some who are more conservative, like Joe Manchin of West Virginia in the Senate. The Democratic Party still has a range. There are more people who we would consider to be center left, with the emphasis on the center, in the House of Representatives. That's people like Abigail Spanberger of Virginia, Alyssa Slotkin of Michigan, number of people, women especially, with national security and foreign policy experience. Then there are those who are sometimes called the Squad, which is the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar wing of the party. But it's very different than the Republican Party, which is much more unified and has moved dramatically to the right.
So let me ask you, Roland. Historically, progressives were middle-class white people who wanted to reform the excesses of the Industrial Revolution 100 years ago. Today, where is the Black community and progressive ideas? There's a sense out there that that there's a conservative social streak in much of the Black community. Is that real? Or
there's always been a conservative social streak among Black people. I mean, look, this is the problem that Democrats have had, Republicans have had, and that is Black people have been far more progressive than anybody. Okay, let's just be real clear, because Black people have been trying to force America, as Dr. King said on numerous occasions, but especially on April 3rd, 1968, in that sermon at Mason Temple, the Mountaintop Sermon. He said, "America, be true to what you put on paper." So African Americans have always been trying to force America to truly be a democracy and live up to its ideals. Hasn't always gone well. Yet when you begin to factor in African Americans strong on religion, so when you talk about being conservative, various views, so Black people are progressive on public policy, on civil rights, on equality, on fairness. Yet when you factor in religion, you factor in family, community, it's a different view. And so African Americans bring all of that together. And that's why Republicans, if they had any sense whatsoever, they would understand they could basically go back to being the Republican Party of old. If they actually embrace civil rights, they would be getting far more African Americans, but they can't do that. And that's also why you have the tension between African Americans and Democrats, because you might have white progressives who want to go another direction. Black people are like, hey, hold up, that's a little too far for us. But this all goes back to the Democratic Party again having a massive tent, and Norman would agree with this, having to satisfy this faction and this faction, to put together a winning coalition. You got to satisfy a whole bunch of people.
If Black Americans are the most loyal element of the Democratic Party voting base, how does a president who wants to be a progressive president, wants to sees himself perhaps as FDR incarnate, how do you balance these competing tensions within the party?
It's always difficult for Democratic presidents to balance those tensions. I would add one little twist to this, which is, we used to think of the Democratic Party, the Progressive Party, as the party of working class and poor people. Now, actually, we've seen some changes. Working class white Americans are the strongest base of the Republican Party right now. And people of color are the strongest base of the Democratic Party. The Hispanic American community is more split than the African American community because you have a significant share there who don't view themselves as people of color. They see themselves as white. And the conservative church element makes a difference there for them as well. But for a Democratic president, you have to take that loyal base of African Americans and not assume that they're going to be with you no matter what. And that means you have to answer some of the questions that are really hot ones in America right now, which include, as Joe Biden has talked about frequently, systemic racism. And we're seeing every day an example of somebody pulled over in the car because they're black and maybe shot or tased or sent to prison. We had the George Floyd murder here that made a huge difference. If you don't respond to those things with criminal justice reform, with voting rights reform, you're going to have a problem with that community. But at the same time, if you only focus on those issues, you're not going to be able to hold necessarily the rest of that coalition. And that coalition, by the way, now includes the possibility of picking off a significant number of college-educated suburban white voters who have been Republicans, but who in 2018 in the midterm election, when Trump was president, were so turned off by him that they elected a Democratic House of Representatives. And if you move too far to the left and too far in the direction of satisfying some of those other coalitions, you may find that they go back to being Republicans. And in this 2020 election, they did go back below the presidential level, and that's why Democrats have such a slim majority in the House and a 50-50 Senate.
And Roland, what do you think about this, Roland? About trying to balance this between the multiple competing elements of this coalition?
Well, that's what I've been saying. I mean, that's the difficulty for any Democrat who's a senator or who is president. You've got competing factions who are important. So when African Americans say we are the most loyal, it's absolutely true, but you also can't win without whites in the suburbs. So you got to appeal to them as well. So you sort of pull in all these directions. See, here's the biggest challenge, frankly, I think and this is really for Democrats. And I've said this specifically to Senator Bernie Sanders, and he's done it, but not in the way I think he really should do it. When Norman said these white working class voters are Republican, the operative word there is not working class, it's white. No Democrat has won a majority of the white vote since LBJ in 1964. You cannot divorce race from white voters who vote Republican, because these white working class voters, I mean, this is just how utterly illogical these folks are. They literally are voting for a party that hates unions. But these white working class voters have fared better historically when they were in unions. These Republican Party is all about the Chamber of Commerce and big business. They're not about a living wage. So these white working class voters, who, as Howard Dean said in 2004, Republicans about God gave guns, and these white working class voters are all about cultural changes. What they're really saying is, and this is where the Democrats have an opportunity, these white folks are saying, oh my God, we're scared to death of these demographic shifts because American values are changing. What they're really saying is we now have to listen to Black people and brown people. And so what Democrats should do is go right at it. Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren should say, I'm going to talk to white people. I said to President Obama when he was president with the Affordable Care Act, I said, you need to go to Mississippi, go to the brokest, whitest, most conservative place and say, I passed this law for you because you have some of the worst health care in America. Democrats have got to be as willing to talk to white people about whiteness just as their willingness to come talk to Black people about Black issues. That is the struggle that they have right now. Republican Party is not going to do it, but Democrats can, but they got to actually say it. Biden has to say, white working class voters, what are you doing? My policies help you. Their policies kill you. So why are you really voting for them?
So, Rob, let me follow up on that. You know, there was a famous book done several years ago called What's the Matter with Kansas? And it was basically, the theme was, why are these people voting in a way that is completely against their own economic self-interest? What's the matter with them? And of course, the answer is just what Roland was saying. Their cultural values and their fear of those demographic shifts has motivated them more than their economic self-interest. And at the same time, our politics have become tribalized. It's not just, well, that's another party, they have different views. It's they're the enemy trying to destroy our way of life, and people are motivated to vote to stop the other enemy more than even their own interest.
When we come back after the break, we're going to continue this conversation and ask our panelists how this translates into Joe Biden's legislative agenda for the big decision after the stimulus bill in just a moment. I loved seeing the NASA Mars rover Perseverance land on the red planet and begin to roll around the hills and valleys of that faraway dot in the sky. This came after the orbiting voyage of the Emirates mission to Mars called Hope. At this moment when Americans and people around the world are bearing the heavy weight of the pandemic, these achievements remind us to reach for the stars, imagine the unimaginable, and commit ourselves to practical steps to achieve what was once thought impossible. That's a theme of one of my favorite films, The Martian, starring Matt Damon, directed by Ridley Scott. The not-so-fantastic story of an astronaut left behind during a human visit to Mars, his remarkable resilience, and the global effort to return to Mars to save him. I particularly love this film because it was shot in one of my favorite spots, Wadi Rum in Jordan, a region made famous for another film, one focused on the past, not the future, the great Lawrence of Arabia. For a look backward and a look forward, check them both out. Again, my panelists today include Roland Martin. Roland is one of America's most insightful and best-informed journalists, with unique insight into the issues that touch the lives of Black Americans. Over the years, he has served as a talk show host on TV One, a network focused on African Americans, a host and analyst with CNN, a senior analyst on the Tom Joyner Morning Show, and he's a widely read author with such books as Speak, Brother, A Black Man's View of America, and The First, President Barack Obama's Road to the White House. Also joining us is Norman Ornstein. Norm is Emeritus Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and one of America's wisest experts on politics, Congress, and the presidency. A native of the great state of Minnesota, he's a contributing editor and columnist for National Journal and The Atlantic magazines, and an election analyst for BBC News. All right, so gentlemen, let's continue where we just were. Joe Biden made stimulus his top priority, but when it comes to the decision to come after stimulus, what the next issue will be for him to pursue in Congress, how does that decision play into this discussion that we're having? Which element of his coalition will he try to appease? Will it be immigration reform? Will it be law enforcement reform? Will it be tax reform? What is going to be his next priority? Norm, let's start with you.
Well, one of the things that Joe Biden will want to do is bring his entire coalition together with things that they can all agree on, and that includes infrastructure. That means a massive additional amount of spending for high-speed broadband in rural areas and in the inner cities, in the urban areas as well. Necessary now if you're going to compete in the global economy, and if you're going to get a job, you have to have that high-speed internet. And he's going to try to do some criminal justice reform where we've seen bipartisan majorities. Nothing's going to be easy for Joe Biden.
So, Roland, when you hear infrastructure and when you hear some tax reform, what does this say to you? You're shaking your head side to side.
Let me tell you something right now. This is real simple. If President Joe Biden, Senator Chuck Schumer, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, if they do not pass a massive, strong, focused John Lewis Voting Rights Act bill, they can kiss 22 goodbye. And they're going to risk thousands of hundreds of thousands marching on DC to tell them you must do it. So I will advise them to tread carefully. You better get it done.
I'm afraid that we have to stop right here. A fascinating exchange. Infrastructure, voting rights. Thank you very much, Roland Martin, Norman Ornstein, for laying it all out for our viewers on Dakhel, Washington. I will admit I was one of those who never, in my worst nightmare, imagined that we would be locked out of schools and offices and locked up in our homes for an entire year as 500,000 of our fellow Americans died of a vicious pandemic. A few weeks, perhaps, even a few months, maybe. Sadly, I could have conceived of 50,000 deaths spread over the 50 states, perhaps even twice that number. But to think that nearly 2% of my life has been spent in pandemic lockdown, that my kids' lives have largely been in suspended animation, that I haven't seen my colleagues or many of my friends for a year, that I haven't been on an airplane for a year, the longest interval of no air travel in 45 years, that I spent nearly a year without seeing my mother before she passed away. All these things are beyond comprehension. And none of that compares to the horror and enormity of 500,000 dead, a number that is 15 times larger than those killed in the Korean War, 9 times larger than those killed in the Vietnam War, 100,000 more than all Americans killed in World War II, and closing in on the number killed over 4 years in the Civil War, a number so horrible one would never think we could even approach it. At the same time, I marvel at the wonders of science that have produced a vaccine, indeed many successful vaccines, in a fraction of time that we first thought possible. Yes, we can send a rover to Mars, as we have just seen, but for us to put our collective energies into solving an urgent, life-threatening danger here on Earth is profoundly reassuring. It not only gives hope about the end of the pandemic, but it says something hopeful about the entire array of threats fueling human misery, from hunger to cancer. If we can solve this, maybe we can solve those problems too. But no silver cloud these days lacks for a dark lining. Here in America, the distribution of vaccines and their ready resupply is awful. Every state, indeed almost every county, seems to be making up its own rules. Where I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, literally a stone's throw into the District of Columbia, the line for me to get the vaccine is miles longer than if I were in my old home just across the boundary. And my county's rules and distribution system is different than other counties in my state, let alone different from other states themselves. In my view, this is madness. Hopefully, this is just a bump in the road to the end of the pandemic, not a sinkhole from which we will never emerge. And hopefully, the day is not far off when historians, not reporters, will be the prime storytellers of the tragedy and heroism of this chapter in American history. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول تاريخ الحد الأدنى للأجور في أمريكا، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.